Welcome back to Queen City Corals. I'm Graham, and today I'm going to be talking about the things that I would do if I started a reef tank in 2024. The first thing that I would do if I started a reef tank now is be a lot more patient than I was originally. My first tank I got when I was about 14 years old. I was a freshman in high school, and I definitely wanted to rush things and try to get my tank looking good and presentable. However, that ended up putting me behind because I ended up adding things too quickly and without doing enough research. I would just say overall being patient, letting the tank cycle, allowing it to actually develop and mature before you start getting into some of the more difficult corals. Because what will happen a lot of times is it'll look like your tank's stabilized, and then you add a bunch of stuff into it and then it throws it all off. But if you would have just gone through and added all those things in a much slower pace, like one coral or fish per week, you're gonna end up with a lot more success because your tank has time to actually adjust to each of those changes rather than adjusting to all of them at once and really getting thrown off and becoming a lot more unstable. The next thing that I would do if I started a reef tank now is definitely do plenty of research. I would do as much research as possible and really be able to understand a lot of different aspects of the reef tank before just jumping straight into it. You definitely can get a lot of information just by going to local fish stores or even talking to other hobbyists, and that is definitely a valuable asset that I would recommend building upon. But at the end of the day, you really need to do a lot of research in this hobby to really understand not only how things work, but why things work in a certain way. For instance, it's important to understand all the various types of equipment you might be adding, because if something were to happen and one of them were to not work, it's good to know how to fix it, and more importantly, just how it works. If you think your skimmer is running, but you're not actually filling up the collection cup, if you don't understand how that works, you might think it's running perfectly fine. But if you don't do the research, you're never gonna know. So it's important to watch as many YouTube videos as you can, read articles, forums, even Facebook posts can sometimes be helpful, but it's definitely good to try to get it from trusted sources, no matter where you're getting it from. Look at their tanks and figure out if it's going to provide good results. Because if someone's tank doesn't look good, then the advice they're giving you probably isn't going to be that great. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to that, but overall, it's definitely important to be able to prove that you have the knowledge by actually putting it into practice and having a nice reef tank in order to take that advice seriously. Now, all of these things that I'm talking about in this video are definitely important, but I think this is the most important and definitely would have saved me personally the most amount of time and money, and that is quarantining your fish and dipping your corals. Now, with the fish especially, I've lost several hundreds of dollars worth of fish because I ended up with either ick or velvet or some other type of disease that ended up wiping out my tank. And because of that, I've definitely learned that it's super important to either buy your fish from a trusted quarantine source or quarantine them yourself. And when I say buy from a trusted source that's quarantining, it's very important that you look into the methods of these places, because I definitely know some local fish stores that claim they have quarantined fish, but when you actually investigate what they mean by that, a lot of times it just means they have copper in their water, and even if they bring in new fish, that time doesn't restart and they don't have an actual procedure for quarantining fish. Here at Queen City Corals, we go through a variety of treatments involving freshwater dips for things like flukes. We also treat with ProziPro, which is a dewormer and anti-parasite. And then finally, we finish with a full cycle of copper treatments, which gets rid of any other parasites such as ick and marine velvet that may have been left over after the Prozi treatment. Now, doing all of this helps to ensure that we're selling fish that are actually disease-free, parasite-free, and nice and healthy, enabling you to confidently and safely purchase fish and add them to your tank without worrying about adding any sort of diseases. Now, after getting quarantined fish, of course, I would definitely recommend dipping your corals no matter where you get them from. Here at Queen City Corals, we have a very extensive dipping procedure for any new corals we get in. We also have quarantine tanks where we place new corals as they come in to make sure that they're nice and healthy and free of any parasites. But even corals from us, I recommend dipping because you never know what can happen, and I definitely wouldn't want to be responsible for someone putting something into their tank that has some sort of pest in it. Now, when it comes to dipping, it's not just actually putting the coral in the dip, it's also inspecting it. So you guys can check out our how to dip corals video up here if you have any other questions about dipping, and we cover how we go through all of our dips, all the different procedures and everything. And I would definitely recommend checking that out before you start adding corals to your tank, because it's very difficult to get pests out of your system, but it's very easy to keep them out. Now, when it comes to purchasing your first aquarium, I would definitely recommend going as big as you can with your budget. There are a couple things to remember though. The water volume you have to change is gonna be more and can be a little bit more difficult, but inevitably you're going to wanna upgrade your tank. So if you start off with something like a 20 gallon, you'll probably end up in a couple of years at a 90 gallon. So it's best to just jump ahead and get that big tank out of the way, especially since it's gonna be a lot easier to maintain. Now, the next thing to remember is that it's not just the tank that you're gonna have to budget for, it's also all the equipment. So I recommend pricing everything out before you jump into it. That way you can make sure you're maximizing your budget and the tank size that you're gonna go with. Now, when you're putting together this budget for your new reef tank, I definitely recommend spending the money on the equipment and making sure that you're getting good, long-lasting equipment. For instance, with your protein skimmer, I typically recommend oversizing it and selecting a bigger version in order to make sure that you can use it later on if you end up upgrading, or if you just end up overstocking your tank, you'll make sure that you have a very hefty duty skimmer. Products like this are definitely built to last, and a few things that I would splurge on are definitely your skimmer and your test kits. These are gonna be some of the most important pieces to your aquarium and things that don't really go bad. For instance, I'm still running a skimmer here at the shop that I got about 8 years ago, and it's still doing great. So things like that are definitely well worth the money and will be a long-term investment in your reefing future. Now, when it comes to test kits, as I said, it's definitely good to invest in a nice set of kits. I recommend the Hanna test kits. They work very well. And speaking of testing, that is the next point that we're gonna talk about, testing your reef tank. This is one of the most important things in the hobby, because if you're not testing, you have no idea why things are happening. If your nitrates are super high or super low and you're running into some sort of nuisance algae, that's probably going to affect it. If your nitrates are super low, it may be that they're stripping it all out and that there is an imbalance in your tank, and that's why you're running into things like cyanobacteria or bryopsis. You'll have no way of knowing these things unless you're actually testing your water. So if I were to start a reef tank today, the one thing that I would definitely focus on when it comes to water quality is testing very frequently. When I first set up a reef tank, I'll usually end up, after cycling, testing once a week, and then I'll back off to every other week after a month or two. But if I see any sort of thing that looks off, or I start to develop some sort of algae, or anything like that, I'll usually start testing again a little bit more frequently just to figure out what that issue is and go ahead and solve it. Now, when it comes to saving money in this hobby, which definitely can be expensive, there are a few different ways that you can go. One way is by buying used equipment. For instance, Facebook Marketplace usually has a ton of used equipment and some really great deals. But it's important to note that sometimes things can be broken or have an issue with them, especially things like tanks could have a busted seal or need to be resealed or have a small leak. So it's good to do some research on that product before you go out and buy it, have them test it there, or even just have a hobbyist friend of yours take a look at it who has a little bit more experience, because they'll usually be able to tell you any issues you might have. Now, another reason why it's good to have some reefing friends or even just a guy at the fish store that you trust is because they can give you cycled media. Now, this is definitely how I would start a reef tank in 2024, because it allows you to jumpstart the cycle and almost entirely skip it. So what cycled media is some sort of rock or bioball or any sort of media or substrate that bacteria can grow on. And what that does is it processes your nutrients for you. So all of the fish poop and fish waste get turned into nitrogen that is no longer harmful for them. Now, the benefit of getting this pre-cycled media is you get a jump on having a more mature tank a lot quicker, so you can add typically more difficult corals a lot earlier, and you can add fish a little bit sooner as well. And I would definitely recommend getting some of this. Some places sell it. We will have it on our website very soon, so keep an eye out for that. or you can get it from a local hobbyist. Having a hobbyist friend is also very helpful because they can guide you, and I would definitely recommend trying to find some sort of mentor. But again, just make sure that their tank looks good and that they actually know what they're talking about to ensure that you are going to have success in the hobby. Now, my last piece of advice for you guys is gonna be to have fun with this hobby. At the end of the day, it is a hobby, so if you're not having fun, there's really not a point in joining it. But I promise you, it is definitely one of the most rewarding and fun hobbies that you will ever experience. I know that it has completely changed my life and made me a much better, happier, and capable person because I've had to learn to use all this different technology, learn about all of the different species and animals and care and husbandry. And it definitely is the best hobby, obviously in my very biased opinion. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like down below. If you have any questions, you can leave a comment. And if you guys want to stay up to date on all of our latest content, make sure to subscribe. And I will see you guys in the next one.